My name is Julian Blackwood. I'm 34 years old, and I'm a high school history teacher from Richmond, Virginia. 3 years ago, I inherited my grandmother's Victorian house in the historic Fan District, a 3-story brick beauty with a wraparound porch, stained glass windows, and a magnolia tree in the backyard that had been there since the Civil War. It was the only thing my grandmother ever gave me that my older sister didn't try to take. Welcome back to Behind Closed Doors Revenge podcast. This is the channel where women finally say out loud the things they carried in silence: family, betrayal, and the quiet moments that rearrange a whole life. If this one speaks to you, drop a comment and stay to the end, because the part where I got the key back isn't the part you're expecting. I remember the day I got the keys. I was 31, single, and living in a cramped apartment above a laundromat where the smell of industrial detergent seeped through the floorboards. When the lawyer called to tell me that Eleanor Blackwood had left me the house on Grove Avenue, I thought it was a prank. My grandmother and I had always been close. I spent every summer of my childhood in that house, learning to bake her famous pound cake, helping her tend to the roses, listening to her stories about growing up in the Depression. But I never expected she'd leave me the house. Not when my sister, Patricia, had been her favorite. Not when Patricia had 2 children and a husband and a mortgage in the suburbs. Not when I was just the schoolteacher who came alone to Sunday dinners and never made a fuss. There must be some mistake, I told the lawyer over the phone. Patricia should have it. She's the one with the family. The lawyer cleared his throat and read directly from the will. To my grandson Julian, I leave the house on Grove Avenue, knowing he will care for it the way I cared for it, with the same hands that helped me plant the garden and the same heart that never once made me feel like I was a burden. To my granddaughter Patricia, I leave my jewelry and my china, as I know she will appreciate them. I drove to the house that afternoon and sat on the porch swing, the same one my grandmother and I had occupied for thousands of summer evenings. The magnolia was in full bloom, and the smell carried me back to a time when the world made sense. I promised her then, out loud, to no one but the ghost she'd left behind, that I would take care of it. That I would be worthy of what she'd given me. That was the first mistake I made. I forgot that in my family, a promise to one person is an invitation to everyone else. For 2 years, the house was my sanctuary. I spent my weekends stripping layers of wallpaper from the parlor walls, discovering original plaster and crown molding that had been hidden since the 1970s. I planted hydrangeas next to the magnolia, painstakingly rebuilt the back porch railing, and learned to fix the old boiler when it groaned through winter mornings. The house was a conversation between me and my grandmother's memory, and I was the only one who spoke the language. On Saturday mornings, I'd make coffee in the kitchen where she'd taught me to separate egg whites, and I'd sit at the breakfast nook watching the sun come up through the stained glass, the same way she had done for 50 years. The house was mine in a way nothing had ever been mine. I had it, and it had me. I got exactly 2 years of that. Then one Tuesday in April, my mother called with a voice like warm caramel and said the sentence that started everything. "Julian, honey, I need to ask you for something." Here was the favor. My mother, Margaret, and my stepfather, Howard, had been living in a rental townhouse in Chesterfield County for the past 5 years. Their landlord had decided to sell the property, and they'd been given 60 days to vacate. They'd been looking at condos and smaller houses, but the market was brutal, and Howard's arthritis had gotten worse. He couldn't manage stairs anymore, not even a few steps. Meanwhile, my sister Patricia and her husband, Mark, had been going through what Patricia called a rough patch and what everyone else called Mark's midlife crisis involving a younger paralegal. Patricia had moved out of their suburban house in March and was now living with our mother and Howard in the townhouse. All of them under one roof, and the roof was about to be taken away. My mother laid it out sweet and simple, the way she'd always laid out every unreasonable request she'd ever made of me. "You've got all that room in grandmother's house, Julian. It's just you there, rattling around in all those empty bedrooms. It would be so good for the family to be together. Just for a little while until we all get back on our feet." I stood in my kitchen, the one where my grandmother's cast iron skillet still hung over the stove, and felt the floor tilt beneath me. I wasn't a monster. They were family. But I'd watched enough family arrangements curdle in other people's lives to know that temporary was the most dangerous word in the English language. So I did what I do when something feels wrong but I'm too polite to say no. I made it formal. I sent my mother an email that night, friendly as a card, with the terms in plain sight. They could stay for 6 months, through October. They'd have the 3 bedrooms on the 2nd floor, there were 4 total, but I was keeping the master for myself. We'd split utilities according to usage. And I put a date on it, November 1st, they'd be out. In the meantime, I'd help them look for a permanent place. My mother replied 5 minutes later. Not a sentence, not a signature, just a series of heart emojis and a message that said, "My boy, always looking out for his family." At the time, I took that as agreement. I know better now. Emojis are not signatures. They're footnotes in a contract that only one person read. They moved in the first weekend of May. My mother brought her china and her crystal and her collection of decorative plates that had to be displayed in the dining room hutch, which meant I had to move my grandmother's Wedgwood to the basement. Patricia brought her resentment and her bitter jokes about how I'd always been the favorite, how grandmother had clearly lost her mind at the end, how a single man had no business in a house this size anyway. Howard brought his recliner, a brown leather monstrosity that went in my living room like a battleship taking over a port. And Mark, who had shown up with Patricia despite the midlife crisis apparently being on hiatus, brought nothing but his laptop and his habit of pacing the hallways while talking loudly on conference calls. The first week was honestly fine. I made breakfast for everyone on Saturday, the way my grandmother used to do. We sat around the table, and for a few hours, it felt like what I'd always imagined a family should feel like. Howard told stories about his early days in the military. Patricia laughed at something my mother said, and the laugh was almost genuine. Mark kept his phone in his pocket, and I pretended to forgive him for what he'd done to my sister. But the rearranging started in week 2. I came home from school on a Thursday and found my living room completely reconfigured. The Victorian settee I'd spent 2 months refinishing had been pushed against the far wall, replaced by Howard's recliner, which now sat in the center of the room, facing the television that Patricia had installed without asking. The television was on at all hours, news in the morning, sports in the afternoon, reality shows at night. My quiet house, which had only ever known the sound of my grandmother's old radio, now throbbed with the noise of a dozen voices, a dozen opinions, a dozen demands. Small things, grain of sand things. I let them go one by one because everyone was still adjusting and the finish line was November. Then May turned to June, and nothing changed. Howard's physical therapist said he needed more space for his exercises, and somehow that space became my first floor study, the one room I'd kept as an office for grading papers and lesson planning. My grandmother had used it as a sewing room, and I'd always felt close to her there, surrounded by the shelves of fabric she'd collected over the years. Now it held a stationary bike, a set of resistance bands, and the lingering smell of icy hot. I moved my laptop to the dining room table and took my grading calls while a television blared in the next room and my mother clanged dishes in the kitchen. In June, Patricia announced that she and Mark were officially separating again, this time for good, she said, with a dramatic sigh that suggested she'd be leaning on me for emotional support. Mark moved to a friend's apartment in Midlothian, but most of his stuff stayed in my house, because Mark was the kind of person who packed by leaving things behind. And Patricia, who had always specialized in taking up space, started talking about the 3rd-floor attic as her art studio, even though she hadn't painted anything since high school and had no plans to start. I kept telling myself it was 6 months. They'd be gone by November. I could hold on until November. But the walls were closing in, and I was too busy smoothing things over to notice that my family had already started measuring them for expansion. My first serious warning came in mid-June. I was in the kitchen, the one place that still felt like mine, trying to make coffee in the percolator my grandmother had taught me to use. My mother breezed in and frowned at the sight of the old glass carafe. "Julian, honey, that thing is ancient. I have a Keurig in my room." We can use that. I like the percolator, I said, keeping my voice even. Grandma showed me how to use it. My mother rolled her eyes, actually rolled them, like I was a child who'd said something embarrassingly naive. It's just coffee, Julian. It doesn't have to be a whole heritage project. I held on to that percolator like it was a life raft. I made my coffee in it every morning, even when my mother sighed loud enough to hear across the house. I made my coffee in it the way my grandmother had taught me, and I drank it alone in the breakfast nook, and I let the silence, the one I used to have all the time, become a thing I only got in sips. The other warning came the weekend of the 4th of July. I'd been invited to a cookout at a colleague's house, and I came home to find my family in the midst of what they called a planning session. They were sitting in my living room, around my coffee table, my grandmother's coffee table, which she'd inherited from her own mother, and they were discussing the renovation. Julian, come sit, my mother said, patting the sofa beside her. We have ideas. I didn't sit. I stood in the doorway of my own living room, watching them as if from a great distance. Patricia was holding a tape measure. If we knock down the wall between the dining room and the parlor, we can make a huge great room. Howard needs more space for his exercises, and Mom wants a dining area that seats more than 6. Howard nodded approvingly. I was thinking we could put a TV niche in the parlor wall. Built-in shelves for the sound system. My mother clapped her hands together. And Patricia needs room for her art studio, so we thought the 3rd floor could be converted, maybe open up the eaves for skylights. They looked at me, waiting for my blessing. I opened my mouth, closed it, opened it again. Those are load-bearing walls, I said finally. You can't just knock them down. The whole structure could be compromised. Patricia waved this away like a pesky fly. We'll get a contractor. It's just a wall, Julian. Also, I said, my voice climbing slightly, this isn't your house. It's my house. You can't just decide to renovate it without asking me. My mother's smile tightened at the edges. Of course we're asking you, sweetheart. We're asking you right now. What do you think? I stood there, caught between the wrong answer and the other wrong answer. The idea of them knocking down walls in my grandmother's house, the house I'd promised to protect, made my chest tight. But the thought of saying no and watching their faces crumple was almost worse. We'll revisit this in November, I said, because I couldn't think of anything else to say. After you've found your own place. Patricia made a sound like a snort. November. Right. You really think we're going to find anything by November? Mom's been looking, I said, because it was true. My mother had been looking at condos, I knew she had. She'd even showed me a few listings on her tablet, all of them too expensive or too small or too far from wherever Howard's doctors were. We've been looking, my mother said smoothly, but these things take time. And with Howard's situation, we need to be careful. Careful, I repeated. So, what are you saying? I'm saying, she said, her voice like honey poured over ice, that we can't put a timeline on family. We're going to need some flexibility. Flexibility. The most terrifying word in the English language. It meant, in my mother's vocabulary, that I would be flexible and she would take everything she could. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in my grandmother's bed, the bed I'd inherited along with the house, the bed where she'd told me stories about her own mother and her own grandmother, and I stared at the ceiling and made bargains with the dark. If I could just make it to November, everything would be fine. If I could be patient, if I could be generous, if I could be the person my family needed me to be, then eventually they would find their own place and I would have my house back and everything would go back to normal. The problem was, I was starting to realize there had never been a normal. There had only been me, paying to be included, and my family, collecting the receipts. The first thing they took was my peace. Maybe that's too dramatic, you can't take peace, technically. It's not a physical thing. But the quiet that I'd cultivated, the silence that my grandmother's house had always given me, the gift of coming home after a long day of teenagers and grading and curriculum meetings to a house that felt like a sanctuary, that was gone. It had been replaced by the constant hum of the television, the endless chatter of my mother on the phone with her sisters, Howard's grunts and sighs as he moved from his recliner to the bathroom, Patricia's sharp laugh at something on her laptop. The house buzzed with people the way a hive buzzes with bees, and I was the beekeeper, but I'd lost my veil. By July, my study was no longer my study. It had become Howard's physical therapy room, and the stationary bike had been joined by a set of hand weights, a foam roller, and a blood pressure monitor that beeped every time he checked it. I'd moved my grading to the dining room table, which was fine except that Patricia had decided the dining room was now a communal workspace and spent her evenings there too, on her laptop, supposedly looking for jobs but mostly scrolling through Facebook and sighing dramatically at whatever she saw there. In mid-July, I came home from a faculty meeting to find the last of my things had been moved from the study to the basement. Not maliciously, my mother assured me, Howard's physical therapist had recommended a clear, open space for his exercises, and my grandmother's old sewing cabinet and fabric collection had been in the way. But no one had called me. No one had asked. They just moved it. My grandmother's sewing cabinet, the one she'd used to make my first Halloween costume, the one with the secret drawer where she'd hidden her wedding ring during a burglary scare in 1985, it was in the basement, next to a collection of Howard's old golf clubs and a box of Patricia's journals. I stood in the basement and looked at my grandmother's sewing cabinet, the pale wood with its delicate inlay, the bent wood handles, the faint smell of lavender that clung to its drawers, and I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, exactly. Something colder. Something that felt like a door closing. "Mom," I said, my voice surprisingly steady when I found her in the kitchen, "that cabinet belonged to grandmother. It's been in the study for decades. You can't just—" "Oh, honey," she said, not looking up from her tablet. "We'll put it back once Howard's done with his therapy. It's just temporary." There's that word again, I thought. Temporary. Like a loan that never gets paid back. Like a promise that only one person has to keep. How long will he need the study? My mother shrugged, an elegant, unconcerned motion. The therapist said at least 3 more months. Then we'll reassess. You can use the dining room table, can't you? You're hardly ever home anyway. I was home every day at 4 p.m. I worked from home every Tuesday and Thursday to grade papers. I had a routine, a schedule, a life that I'd carefully built around this house and its rhythms. But my mother had rearranged the narrative so that I was the one who didn't belong, the one who was always in the way, the one whose presence was an inconvenience. I looked at her, my mother, who had always been so proud of me, who had always told me I was her good son, her sweet boy, and I realized, with a clarity that felt like a wound, that I had never been her good son. I had been her useful son. And I had been so desperate to be loved that I'd mistaken usefulness for love. "I'll clear out the garage," I said, because I couldn't say what I really wanted to say. "I'll make space for his exercise equipment there." My mother looked up at that, her eyes sharpening with something like calculation. "The garage? But that's where Mark's things are stored." I'd forgotten about Mark's things. Mark, who had moved out in June but left behind 3 bikes, a weight bench, and a collection of old vinyl records that he swore he'd come back for. The garage, once my grandmother's garage, a place that had held her car and her gardening supplies and the ladder she'd used to paint the windowsills, was now a holding tank for my sister's soon-to-be ex-husband's belongings. "I'll move his stuff," I said, the words sour in my mouth. "I'll make it work." My mother smiled at me, a warm, satisfied smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. That's my boy. Always looking out for the family. The garage annexation was just the beginning. My grandmother's house, with its 4 bedrooms and 3 floors, had always been spacious, but my family had a way of expanding to fill whatever space was available. By August, I had been displaced from the 2nd floor entirely. Patricia had taken the bedroom next to the main bath, the one with the window seat where I used to read. Howard and my mother had taken the room at the back of the house, the one that had once been my grandmother's, because it had an attached bath and was quieter than the front room. And the two remaining bedrooms, one of which had been my grandmother's sewing room, the other a guest room, were now storage, filled with bins and boxes and clothes that no one had worn in years. I moved into the third-floor attic. The space had been converted into a bedroom when I was a child, but it had never been fully finished. The ceiling sloped sharply on both sides, making it impossible to stand up straight near the walls. The only heat came from a space heater my grandmother had used in the winter. But it had a window that faced the magnolia tree, and at night, I could lie in bed and watch the moonlight filter through the leaves. It's just temporary, I told myself, every time I climbed the narrow stairs to my new room. They'll be out by November. But somewhere in the back of my mind, a quiet voice was starting to speak up, a voice that sounded a lot like my grandmother's, strong and no-nonsense. The voice said, "Julian, what makes you think they're going to leave? They've been here for 3 months, and they haven't even started looking at places. They've moved your possessions to the basement, claimed your office, taken over your garage. They're not treating this like a temporary stay. They're treating it like a permanent move. When are you going to realize that?" I ignored the voice. I was good at ignoring it. I'd been ignoring it my whole life. The full takeover happened on the third weekend of August. I came home from a weekend trip to Charlottesville, a rare escape, a few days of peace at a friend's cabin, and I could tell something was wrong before I even opened the front door. The porch swing, my grandmother's porch swing, was gone. In its place was a plastic patio set and a cooler full of drinks. I walked inside and found my family in the parlor, standing around my grandmother's coffee table like they were holding a board meeting. When they saw me, their voices dropped abruptly. "Julian," my mother called, her voice cheery but strained. "We didn't expect you back until tomorrow." "I got back early," I said, my eyes sweeping the room. The furniture had been rearranged again. A new piece had been added, a dark green velvet armchair that looked like it had been purchased at a yard sale. It sat in the corner where my grandmother's reading chair had always been. I looked at Patricia, who had taken the armchair as her own, her feet tucked up beneath her, her laptop balanced on the armrest. "That chair," I said slowly, "is where grandmother used to sit and read. It's been in this family since the 1950s. Why did you remove it?" "It was falling apart," Patricia said, not looking up from her laptop. "The fabric was frayed, the springs were shot. This one is much more comfortable." "It was my grandmother's chair," I repeated. "I gave you permission to stay here temporarily. I didn't give you permission to replace my grandmother's furniture." My mother stepped between us, smiling, placating. "Julian, honey, you're making a mountain out of a molehill. It's just a chair. We put the old one in the basement. You can always keep it for sentimental reasons." "Patricia found this beauty at Goodwill," my mother said, patting the armchair. She thought the room needed a pop of color. Sentimental reasons. As if what I felt for that chair was just some nostalgia, a childish attachment to a piece of furniture. I looked at my mother, her smooth, practiced smile, her patient, pitying expression, and I realized that she would never understand. She couldn't understand. She'd never had a grandmother who gave her the whole world, who handed her a house and a heritage and asked only that she treasure it. She'd never been the one who had to protect something against the casual greed of the people who were supposed to love her. I walked out of the parlor without another word. I went upstairs to my room in the attic, the one with the sloping ceiling and the space heater and the window that faced the magnolia tree. I sat on my bed and I listened to the sounds of the house settling around me, the creak of floorboards, the murmur of voices, the faint hum of the television downstairs. And I did something I'd never done in this house, something that felt like a betrayal of everything my grandmother had given me. I started to plan. I found my grandmother's deed in a lockbox in the basement, tucked behind a row of books she'd collected over the years. The lockbox had a combination that I'd known since I was a child, her birthday, May 10th, 32, and inside it were documents I'd never looked at closely. Her marriage certificate, her birth certificate, her mother's obituary. And the deed to the house, dated 1963, signed by my great-grandfather and his wife, transferring ownership to my grandmother and her new husband. The deed said Eleanor Blackwood, sole proprietor. I sat on the basement stairs, holding the deed in my hands, the paper yellowed and fragile, and I felt a strange sense of comfort. This house was hers. And then it was mine. The deed was the evidence, a thing that existed outside of my mother's stories and Patricia's grievances and the endless negotiation of just a little while longer. The deed was law, and the law didn't care how my family felt about it. I started making copies. Not just of the deed, but of everything. The mortgage statements, which I'd been paying since I moved in. The property tax records, which listed me as the sole owner. The insurance documents, which bore only my name. The stack of emails I'd sent my mother, the ones with the terms of their stay, the ones with the November 1st deadline. I made copies of everything, and I put them in a bright red folder that I'd bought at an office supply store. And then I went to see a lawyer. Her name was Patricia, ironically, the same name as my sister, and she had an office in a high-rise downtown, with a view of the James River and a wall of law books that made my head spin. She was about my age, with sharp eyes and a way of listening that felt like she was taking everything I said and filing it away for later. I brought her the folder and told her the story. From the beginning, the day my mother had called and asked for a little favor, up to the chair replacement and the garage annexation and the fact that I was now living in an unheated attic in my own house. Patricia the lawyer listened without interrupting. She flipped through my documents one by one, reading the deed, scanning the emails, noting the dates and the details. When I was finished, she sat back in her chair and folded her hands on her desk. "Here's the truth," she said, her voice calm and matter-of-fact. "Your family has been living in this house for over 3 months. They receive mail here. They have moved their belongings in. In the eyes of the law, they are residents, not guests. You can't simply change the locks or throw their things out on the street. That would be an illegal eviction, and they could take you to court over it." I felt my stomach drop. "But it's my house. My name is on the deed." "Your name is on the deed," she said, "and that's a powerful thing. But it doesn't give you the right to unilaterally remove residents who have established tenancy. The way this works, Mr. Blackwood, is that you would have to evict them formally. You'd have to file a case in court, give them proper notice, and wait for a judge to rule. It's a process. It takes time." "How much time?" Patricia the lawyer shrugged. 8 to 12 weeks, if nothing goes sideways. More if they contest it. And they will contest it, because that's what families do in situations like this. I sat in her office and felt the walls close in around me. 8 to 12 weeks. My mother and Patricia and Howard would be in my house for at least 2 more months. And that was if I started the process now. That was if I had the courage to file an eviction against the people who had raised me. "There's another option," Patricia the lawyer said, her voice gentler now. "You could offer them an incentive to leave. Cash for keys, a sum of money that would cover their moving costs and a new deposit. It's common in rental situations when a landlord wants a tenant out quickly." "Money," I repeated. "I have to pay them to leave my own house." "The alternative is the court process," she said. "Which is slower and more expensive in the long run. You have to decide whether you want to be generous or whether you want to be right." I sat there and did the math. The down payment, the years of saving, the sacrifices I'd made to get this house. I'd done it all myself, no help, no cosigner. I'd worked 2 jobs during college, lived in the basement of a rental house with 4 other guys, eaten ramen and canned soup until I was 25. The house was the only thing I'd ever had that was purely mine. And now, to get it back, I was being told I might have to pay my family to leave. I asked her for 2 weeks to think about it. She nodded and told me to keep the folder safe. "Don't keep it in the house," she said. "Not if they're looking through your things. I've seen it before, people in your position, they keep evidence in the house, and it disappears. Keep it in your car. Somewhere they can't find it. I left her office and drove home, my mind churning. The evidence was in the trunk, in the little compartment where the spare tire went. I'd wrapped the red folder in a waterproof bag and hidden it beneath the tire iron. It was the most secure place I could think of, and even as I did it, I felt a low-grade shame. My own house, and I had to keep my documents in my car to keep them safe from the people living there. The cash for keys offer turned out to be one of the most humiliating experiences of my life. I set up a family meeting for a Saturday afternoon. I made coffee, in my grandmother's percolator, which I'd managed to keep hidden in my room, and I sat my mother, Howard, and Patricia down at the dining room table. I had a piece of paper with me, a carefully worded proposal that I'd typed up and printed at the library. "Here's the deal," I said, keeping my voice level. "I want to help all of you. I've been thinking about this, and I think the best thing is for me to contribute to your moving costs. I'm willing to give you $5,000 toward a deposit on your own place, plus cover your first month's rent. And I'll help you move. I'll rent a truck and do the lifting myself." My mother's expression didn't change. She sat with her hands wrapped around her coffee cup, her face smooth as porcelain. "Julian, we've been over this. We need time. Time is what you've had. You've been here 4 months now. The original agreement was 6 months, and I'm willing to go to October, which is 8 months, but I need a firm date. I need to know when you're leaving." Patricia made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a scoff. "You think you can buy us out for $5,000? This is my grandmother's house. I have as much right to be here as you do." "Actually," I said, and I hated the way my voice came out, tight and defensive, "you don't. Grandmother left the house to me. That's what the will says. I'm the one who's been paying the mortgage and the taxes. I'm the one who should be able to decide who lives here." "Grandmother was senile at the end," Patricia said, her voice sharp as glass. "She didn't know what she was doing. Everyone knows the house should have gone to me. I'm the one with the children. I'm the one who needs the space." I looked at my mother, waiting for her to step in, to say something. But she just sat there, watching me over the rim of her coffee cup, as if this were some kind of performance that she was evaluating. "Mom," I said, my voice cracking slightly, "can you please talk to her?" My mother set down her coffee cup. "Patricia is right about one thing, Julian. You're the only one who's been paying the bills, but this house is the family's house. It belongs to all of us. You can't just buy us out and push us aside." "I'm not pushing you aside," I said. "I'm trying to work with you. I'm trying to be generous." "Generous," my mother repeated, the word tasting sour on her tongue. "You're trying to get rid of us. There's a difference." I sat there in my own dining room, in my own house, surrounded by the people I loved, and I realized that I'd already lost. No matter how much I offered, no matter how generous I tried to be, I would never be generous enough. I would always be the one who held them back, the one who didn't care enough, the one who put his own comfort above his family's needs. They had already written that story in their heads. I was just trying to live in it. I didn't give them the $5,000. I put the proposal back in its envelope and went upstairs to my attic room. That night, I sat on the floor with my back against the sloped wall, and I made my decision. October 1st came and went, and no one packed a single box. On October 15th, I served my family with a formal eviction notice. Patricia the lawyer had drafted it, a legal document that laid out in precise language the terms of their removal from my property. The notice gave them 30 days to vacate. It cited the original agreement, the emails I'd sent my mother, the fact that no rent had ever been paid. It was everything the law required, and I delivered it in person, one copy to each of them, handed over like I was handing out dinner plates. My mother read the notice twice, her lips moving silently over the words. Then she folded it into a neat square and put it in her pocket. "You're doing this to your own mother," she said, her voice flat and dead. "You've had 4 months," I said. "You knew this was coming." Patricia threw the notice on the floor and walked out of the room. Howard stood up slowly from his recliner, his face pale and uncertain. "I'm sorry," I said to Howard, "because I meant it. I can't keep doing this. I need my house back." Howard looked at me with eyes that held something like pity. "Your mother won't forgive you for this." "I know," I said. "But I'm not doing it for her forgiveness." The 30 days passed in a blur of cold silences and whispered conversations. My mother stopped talking to me entirely. Patricia would only speak to me in monosyllables, and even then, she did it with her back turned. Howard kept his head down, moving through the house like a ghost. The tension was thick as smoke, and I found myself avoiding the common areas, spending my evenings in my attic room, working by lamplight and trying not to hear the sounds of the family I was about to lose. On November 15th, I filed the eviction papers. Patricia the lawyer helped me with the forms, a thick stack of legal documents that I had to deliver to the courthouse in person. The clerk took my filing fee and stamped my paperwork without comment. She saw 100 of these a week, she told me, and I could come back for my hearing date in a few days. "Who's the plaintiff?" she asked, not looking up. "Julian Blackwood." "And the defendant?" I looked at the paper in my hand, where the names were listed. "Blackwood. My family." She nodded and stamped the folder. "We'll set a hearing for December. You'll get a notice in the mail." I stood there for a long moment, looking at the folder that had been stamped and filed and accepted. In 48 hours, my family would be served with a court summons. And then we would all be standing in a courtroom, under fluorescent lights, in front of a judge who didn't care about our history or our grievances. It was the saddest thing I'd ever been a part of, and I'd done it to myself. The hearing was December 10th, the second Tuesday of the month. It was cold that morning, the kind of cold that bites through coats and settles in your bones. I wore the only suit I owned, a navy blue thing that I'd bought for my grandmother's funeral, and I sat in the courthouse waiting area with my hands shaking. My family arrived 20 minutes late. My mother walked in first, dressed as if she were going to church, her hair perfectly coiffed, her face smooth as marble. Patricia followed, wearing a floral dress that she must have brought from home. Howard trailed behind, leaning on his cane, his face gray with exhaustion or shame. I couldn't tell which. They didn't look at me. They took seats on the opposite side of the courtroom, as far away from me as possible. The judge was a woman about my mother's age, with silver-streaked hair and a voice that carried authority like a scent. She looked at the papers in front of her, asked the bailiff to call the case, and then turned to me. "Mr. Blackwood, you filed a forcible entry and detainer action against the defendants. Please state your case." I stood up, my legs unsteady beneath me. "Your Honor, I own this house. I inherited it from my grandmother, and I've been paying the mortgage and the property taxes. My family has been living there since May, and they've refused to leave, even though I gave them proper notice." "Mr. Blackwood, do you have proof of ownership?" "Yes, Your Honor," I said, and I produced the deed, the mortgage statements, the property tax records. I'd brought copies for everyone, and the bailiff handed them to the judge. She looked through them carefully, nodding. "And you have copies of the notices you sent?" "Yes, Your Honor," I said, and I produced the 30-day notice, the certified mail receipts, the official filings. "Were you aware, Mr. Blackwood, that the defendants have a counterclaim?" I blinked. "A counterclaim?" The judge looked at my family. "Ms. Blackwood, your counterclaim?" Patricia stood up, her voice trembling with rehearsed emotion. "Your Honor, my grandmother promised me this house. She told me, before she died, that she would leave it to me, but then she changed her will. My brother took advantage of her. He manipulated her when she was old and frail and couldn't think clearly. And now he's trying to kick us out, to kick out my mother and my stepfather and me, when we have nowhere else to go." My mother nodded along, her eyes fixed on the judge with a look of careful desperation. "I see," the judge said, her voice flat and unimpressed. "And do you have any evidence of this? A document, a letter, a witness statement?" Patricia hesitated. She told me. Many times. I see, the judge said again, and there was something in her voice that sounded almost like pity. Miss Blackwood, I'm going to explain something to you. In the state of Virginia, real estate promises must be in writing. Verbal agreements are not binding. Unless you have a signed document that proves your grandmother intended to leave you this house, your claim cannot be considered. Patricia sat down hard. I could see her jaw tighten, her hands clench in her lap. The judge turned to my mother. Mrs. Blackwood, you've been living in this house for several months without paying rent. Is that correct? My mother stood up slowly, smoothing her skirt with deliberate grace. Your Honor, this is my mother's house. My son was kind enough to let us stay while we found new living arrangements. Mr. Blackwood gave you a written notice to vacate. Did you receive it? Yes, Your Honor. And you've taken no steps to find a new residence? We've tried, my mother said, her voice catching perfectly on the edge of tears. The market is so tight. We've been looking everywhere. There just isn't anything in our price range. The judge looked at her for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she looked at the papers in front of her, and I could see the calculations taking place behind her eyes. Mrs. Blackwood, she said finally, I'm going to give you until January 15th to vacate the premises. That's 30 days from today. If you have not moved out by that date, I will issue a writ of restitution, and the sheriff will remove you and your belongings. My mother's composure cracked for just a moment. I saw it in the way her hands tightened on the back of the chair, in the way her throat worked as she swallowed. Your Honor, she said, her voice barely steady, we have nowhere to go. My husband is ill. We're trying to find a place, but it's so hard. The court's ruling is final, the judge said, and there was a tone in her voice that brooked no argument. You have 30 days. I suggest you use them wisely. My family used every single day of that 30-day period. They didn't speak to me during the holidays. I spent Christmas alone in my attic room, eating takeout from a Chinese restaurant that was open for the holiday. I could hear them downstairs, exchanging gifts and laughing, and I felt like an intruder in my own house. On New Year's Eve, I went to bed at 9 o'clock and lay in the dark, watching the moonlight filter through the magnolia tree, and wondered if I had made a terrible mistake. On January 10th, 5 days before the deadline, my mother came to me. She stood at the bottom of the attic stairs and called up to me in a voice so quiet I barely heard it. Julian? Can we talk? I went down the stairs, my heart pounding. She was standing in the hallway, her coat on, her purse over her arm. She looked smaller than I remembered, somehow. Older. We're leaving, she said. I found a place. It's small, but it's near the bus line, and Howard can manage the stairs. I didn't know what to say. Mom. I'm sorry. I didn't want it to happen this way. Didn't you? Her voice was brittle. I think you always wanted it to happen this way. You just needed an excuse. That's not true, I said. I've been trying to make this work for months. I gave you every chance. You call putting your own mother out on the street a chance? You didn't have to get put out on the street, I said, and I could feel my voice rising, the anger I'd been trying to suppress finally breaking through. You could have found a place months ago. You could have worked with me. Instead, you and Patricia just kept moving in, kept taking over, kept acting like this was your house and I was just some kind of guest. And when I tried to set boundaries, you made me the villain. My mother stared at me for a long moment, her eyes cold and flat. Then she turned away. We'll be out by tomorrow, she said. I'll send Patricia to get the rest of her things. And she left. They were gone by January 14th. I came home from work that evening and found the house empty. Not just the people, the furniture was gone too. The dining table, the chairs, the velvet armchair, the TV, the recliner. The walls were bare, the floors clean, the closet swept. It was as if they had never been there at all. Except for the basement. I went down the stairs slowly, my heart thudding in my chest. The basement was a disaster. Boxes were stacked in the corner, their labels reading Patricia Art Supplies and Howard Medical Equipment and Mom Christmas Decorations. The boxes that held my grandmother's sewing cabinet had been overturned, and the contents, the fabric, the patterns, the sewing machine, were scattered across the floor like trash. But the worst was the back wall. Where my grandmother's old bookcases had once stood, there was now a pile of broken wood. It looked like someone had taken a hammer to them, smashed them into kindling. I stood there in the rubble and tried to understand what I was seeing. They'd destroyed it. They'd taken everything they wanted and destroyed the rest. I found the note taped to the inside of the basement door. It was written in my mother's careful hand, on a piece of stationery that had once belonged to my grandmother. Julian. We have moved out of your house. Patricia's belongings are in the basement. We will come back for them when we find a permanent place. Your grandmother would have wanted you to be a better person than this. I hope you think about that every time you walk through those rooms. Love, Mom. I stood there with the note in my hand, and something inside me broke. Not the way it had broken when they'd first moved in, or when I'd filed the eviction, or when I'd sat alone on Christmas. This was different. This was the breaking of the last thread that had held me to the family I thought I had. They had known, all along. They had known what they were doing, and they had done it anyway. And I would never forgive them. The first week after they left was a strange, suspended time. I went through the house room by room, cleaning up the mess they'd left behind. I threw away the broken bookcases and the scattered fabric. I swept the basement floor and washed the walls. I aired out the bedrooms and replaced the doorknobs. They'd taken some of them, I discovered, the antique ones that my grandmother had brought from her own mother's house. I took a deep breath and decided to restore the house to the way it had been before they'd arrived. It was a slow, painstaking process. I hired a carpenter to replace the broken bookcases. I found an antique dealer who sold me a set of doorknobs that matched the ones they'd taken. I bought a new piece of fabric for the reading chair, but I couldn't find the same pattern, and I sat in the shop and felt a wave of grief so profound that I almost walked out. In February, I received a letter from my mother. It was on her old stationery, the kind she'd used to write to me when I was at summer camp, a pale lavender envelope with her careful script on the front. Julian. I've been thinking a lot about what happened. I want you to know that I don't hold any anger toward you. I understand that you felt you had to do what you did. But I also want you to know that Patricia and I will never be the same. We have lost our home, and we have lost our family. I hope this was worth it to you. I hope you find what you were looking for. Love always, Mom. I read the letter twice, and then I put it in a drawer. I didn't write back. I couldn't think of anything to say that wouldn't sound like an apology, and I was done apologizing for wanting to own my own life. In March, I started seeing a therapist. I'd never been to therapy before, because therapy was something my family didn't believe in. If you had a problem, you handled it yourself, you didn't talk to strangers about it. But I'd reached the point where I couldn't handle it myself anymore. I had nightmares about the basement, about the broken bookcases, about the note on the door. I had moments where I thought I heard my mother's voice in the house, and I'd turn around to find myself alone. The therapist was a kind woman with silver hair, named Charlotte. She listened to my story without interrupting, and when I was done, she leaned back in her chair and took a long breath. "You're angry," she said. "And that's understandable. But you're also grieving." "Grieving what?" "Grieving the family you thought you had," she said. "The family that was supposed to love you unconditionally. The family that was supposed to see your generosity and your kindness and return it with love. You gave them so much, and they took it all, and they still wanted more." I sat there in her office and felt my throat tighten. "Now you have to decide what you want," she said. "Do you want to keep trying to earn their love, even though it's never going to be enough? Or do you want to let it go? Let it go? Let go of the expectation that they'll ever love you the way you need them to. Let go of the hope that they'll come back and apologize and be the family you've always wanted. Let go of the guilt that makes you feel like you're the bad person. You're not the bad person, Julian. You're just a person who found the courage to say no. It took me a long time to understand what she meant. I spent the spring and summer rebuilding my life, piece by piece. I fixed the holes in the walls, repainted the rooms, bought new furniture that wasn't a replacement for what I'd lost. I started having friends over, old friends and new friends, people who didn't know the story or who didn't care about it. I filled my house with laughter and food and the sound of music, and slowly, I started to feel alive again. In July, I went to my grandmother's grave for the first time since the eviction. I stood at the grave of Eleanor Blackwood, the woman who had given me the house and everything that came with it, and I told her about what had happened. I told her I'd made mistakes, that I'd let things go too far, that I'd been too afraid to say no. I told her I was sorry it had come to that. And I told her about the healing. About the new doorknobs, the new bookcases, the friends laughing in the parlor. I told her that the house was still standing. That it was still hers, in some way, because it was still mine. The sun set over the headstones, and I walked away feeling lighter than I had in years. In September, I got a letter from my mother. Not on stationery this time, it was a printed card, the kind you'd buy at a drugstore, with a generic sentiment about family and love. Inside, she'd written, "Julian, we're thinking of you. I know this hasn't been easy. I just wanted you to know that we've found a place to live, a little apartment in Chesterfield. It's small, but it works for us. Howard's health is stable. Patricia is working at a coffee shop and looking for something better. We're doing okay. I don't want to fight with you anymore. I'm too old for that. Whatever happened, it happened. I want to move forward. Would you come for dinner? I'd like to see you. I'd like us to be family again. Love, Mom." I put the card down and stared at it for a long time. The old patterns, the old ways. We'll forget this ever happened. We'll paper over it with kindness and pretend that we didn't wound each other. It's what my family did. We never apologized, never explained, never processed. We just moved on, leaving the wreckage in our wake. But this time was different. This time, I had a choice. I went to the dinner. It was a small apartment in Chesterfield, a 2-bedroom place with a view of the parking lot and an elevator for Howard. My mother had made pot roast, her specialty, and Patricia was there with a new boyfriend, a quiet man named Derek who seemed to be tolerated by the family. Howard sat in his recliner, watching the game, and at some point in the evening, he caught my eye and gave me a small, sad smile. We didn't talk about what had happened. We talked about Howard's health, Patricia's job search, my new hobby of painting the house. The conversation was polite and careful and full of things unsaid. And when I left, at the end of the evening, my mother hugged me at the door. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice husky. "Thank you for having me," I said. We stood there for a moment, awkward and uncertain. Then I went home to my grandmother's house, the house that was mine, and I walked through the rooms and said a small prayer of thanks. It wasn't a reconciliation. It wasn't a pardon or an apology or a return to the way things used to be. It was just a step, a tentative step, on uncertain ground. And I took it, and it felt like the right thing to do. A year later, I took a picture of my grandmother's sewing cabinet. I'd spent the summer restoring it, oiling the wood and replacing the handles. It was back in the study, where it belonged. And one day, I opened the secret drawer, the one where she'd hidden her wedding ring, and I found something I'd missed before. It was a letter, yellowed and fragile, written in my grandmother's careful hand. The letter was dated 2 weeks before her death, and it was addressed to me. "Julian. If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you've taken possession of the house. I wanted to write to you, to tell you some things that I never said out loud. First, I want you to know that I left you the house because you are the one who would take care of it. You are the one who would know what it means. Patricia and your mother, they would love it, in their way, but they would use it. They would fill it with their things and make it smaller. You would make it bigger. You would make it a home. Second, I want you to know that I know what they will do to you. It's what they've always done. They'll take and take and take, and they'll make you feel like you're the selfish one for trying to hold on to something for yourself. They did it to me too. But here's what I learned, in the end. They will never stop taking. And you will never stop giving, because that's who you are. The only difference is whether you give because you want to or give because you have to. Don't give because you have to, Julian. Give because you want to. And when you don't want to, say no. I love you. I'm proud of you. And I know you'll take care of this house. Grandmother. I sat in the study with the letter in my hands, and I didn't cry. I'd done enough crying. Instead, I felt something else. Something like peace. I put the letter in a safe deposit box at the bank, along with the deed and the mortgage documents. And I kept it there, a reminder that I wasn't alone. That I had someone in my corner, even if she was gone. The house stood behind me, quiet and strong and full of ghosts. And I knew, with a certainty that settled into my bones like heat from a fire, that I was home. If you've ever been the one who gives until it hurts, the responsible one, the one who always pays, this story is going to feel familiar. If someone's temporary stay is slowly erasing you from your own life, take this as your sign. Put it in writing today. Have the difficult conversation. Choose yourself, even when it feels like you're betraying everyone else. The house is mine. The life is mine. And it took losing everything to finally understand what I had. Drop a comment below, tell me where you're listening from, and be sure to subscribe because you will want to hear how this one ends. This is Julian Blackwood, signing off from the house on Grove Avenue, where the magnolia tree still blooms and the ghosts finally forgive.